what exactly do we mean by disabled? Why do we use the terms disability and disabled rather than diffability, differently abled, special, or different? What exactly are disabling barriers? Hi, I'm Cass from Hills FM, and today I bring you a very insightful and excitement topic for your ears only, with a very special guest. As you might have seen from the intro, we're going to be talking all things disability, but especially and more focused on the arts. Today, I have a very special guest with me to talk about this. Her name is Eleanor Hayes, and she's the creative producer at Shape Arts. And if you don't know what Shape Arts is or what they're about, Shape Arts is a disability-led arts organization that strives to promote disabled people's access to culture by offering chances for disabled artists and many, many other things that they're great for. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into this interview. Okay, just to start, can you let me know a bit about you and what Shape Arts is and what you're all about?
So Shape Arts is a arts organisation, obviously based in the UK, but we work to some degree internationally as well. And we work to remove barriers to creative excellence, which is quite a deliberately phrased thing. We're disability led, which basically means that most of the people involved with Shape are disabled, but also that we're led by kind of the social model of disability and the disabled artists that we work with. So I guess the primary thing to explain about our kind of philosophy and our aims is that the social model of disability is what is basically our foundation. And that basically says that people aren't like disabled by any kind of health problems or impairments or medical issues. They're disabled by society not being fit for their needs, and they're facing barriers because of that. So it's an external thing rather than an internal thing. And as a kind of working theory, it provides a lot of agency to disabled people, and it's also quite it provides a bit of like liberation, or at least hope for liberation politics, that kind of thing. And it's also quite intersectional, so it's quite malleable as far as kind of social theory goes. And I guess in our context, it's probably actually less theory than practice. It's much more practice, because on a day-to-day basis, we work with artists who quite literally face barriers, and those barriers obviously look very different for different people. It might be physical, it might be attitudinal, it might be social, but they're, you know, very, very varied. But basically our starting point is marginalized people face barriers when accessing the arts, be they audience, artist, administrator, whoever. So we kind of see our job as removing the barriers in order to support and facilitate the careers of disabled creatives. Within that, my specific role, I'm a creative producer, but I do a bit of everything. So I work across kind of program where I do some of the curation and artist development, artist support, things like that. And then I also manage the communication, so things like social media, newsletters, and then I run the press as well. So that's like press releases, relationships with journalists and things like that. So we're quite a small and very flexible team. So we're funded by Arts Council England. Our main program, we're what's known as an NPO, which is a national portfolio organization, which means that we get kind of like continual funding to be an arts organization, although we are also a charity. And so basically that means that there's parts of our program that we have to do year on year because they're in our kind of plan that the Arts Council have agreed to. But being a small team and being a charity as well, and being able to kind of, I don't know, stretch and contract very easily means that we can there's still a lot of our program that's maybe not spontaneous, but like a little bit more on the fly, things that we can pick up, and projects that we can kind of agree to last minute. So that's quite good, I think, about our program. And in terms of the history of Shape, we've been going this is our 45th year, I believe. I think, yeah, 1976. So this is our 45th year. And it's kind of gone through so many changes. Obviously, so when it started, it was very much coming out of a lot of social, political organizing around disability rights and something called the disability arts movement. So kind of like the historical backdrop to this is like the disability rights movement, the disability arts movement, which is kind of a whole thing, whole microcosm in and of itself. And obviously generally the arts landscape in the UK. So in 1976, we came into being, probably much more as an organization who was providing disability equality training and access audits, which we still do with our partners. So institutions, organizations, individuals, basically anyone of any scale can come to us and say, I have this project, I have this building, I have this idea, how do I make it accessible? And depending on where it falls, so if it's like an artistic project, then we'll probably deal with it under program. If it's like a building, then it probably goes to our partners, GOS Consultancy, who do very kind of detailed and very professional disability equality training and access audits and things like that. So we kind of operate everywhere is the long and short of that. We pop up in a lot of places like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
But yeah, through the years, it's changed a lot. I mean, especially in size, we used to be based elsewhere. And I think that the point that we're at now is much more, we went through a period probably 10-ish years ago where the fact that we were a charity was much more relevant to day-to-day proceedings, because there was like a whole fundraising team who would raise funds for a program which didn't change very much. So it was very kind of formulaic and very much how a lot of charities operate in the UK at the minute. But now we're much less, like we don't rely on donations in any sense, and we don't really do kind of fundraising drives. We do get donations. For example, at some point last year, we received a donation from somebody's will, which was just unexpected. We recently partnered with the shoe company, and they give us donations as well, they give us an annual donation as part of the partnership, and then sometimes we do projects with them which generate more money, so then they give us other donations. So we get donations in, but the charity model is very much kind of yesterday's news at Shape. But now we're trying to move towards more of a kind of creative agency or service provider. So we'll have like in-house creatives. We have an office in Peckham Library, and I think the direction that we're heading in now is very much more trying to organically support inspire and radicalize the disabled community that exists within the arts landscape, which is obviously like bigger than most people realize it is, and doesn't look like what most people think it looks like.
Oh, it doesn't, like, I didn't have that. Obviously, like I read about you in your website and stuff, but I didn't expect the magnitude of it. So when you're explaining it, I was like, oh my God, that's so much going on. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, there's quite a lot.
Yeah, so how did you come into Shape Arts? Like, how were you introduced to it? How did you decide that you wanted to do that as a job?
Well, when I graduated uni a few years ago, and I knew I wanted to work in the arts, and I knew that I wanted to work in, I think what at the time I probably would have called like socially engaged arts, or like community arts. I probably wouldn't call it that now, but at the time I basically knew I didn't want to work in a commercial gallery. And I wanted to do something with some kind of like political agency behind it. And I was going to volunteer, I think, with Shape. And then I basically just like had lots of conversations with Shape in the process of being a volunteer, and then ended up with a job here essentially a couple of years ago. So it kind of just like snowballed. But it's interesting because I think that the flexibility really does apply to everything. Like though we're a small core team, so there's me, Jeff, who is head of program, and our CEO David. We are basically the kind of like core creative team in terms of in-house. And then we work with freelancers, and we have a finance team, and we also co-deliver Unlimited, which is like a whole other project.
Yeah.
It's like the world's largest commissioning program for disabled artists, which we co-deliver with Arts Admin, who are a different arts organization. So it's all a bit of a web, really, as is the way a lot of the time with Arts Council projects. So we also employ people who work full-time on Unlimited, but they won't work on the kind of SHAPE program. So it's very sprawling. But yeah, I think that it's interesting because we're in a position where we know so many, we have such a big network that it's easy for us to offer opportunities to people when we're working on projects. And obviously, like, it's a bit of a complex one, because in the arts, being a freelancer is simultaneously putting yourself in a very vulnerable position, but also giving yourself quite a lot of agency to do a lot of fun stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's always funny working with freelancers, because we really have to kind of establish that we will, I guess, kind of treat them a bit like an employee, but obviously not financially or legally, in the sense that they won't be signing those kind of contracts. But we try to make sure that the fair compensation is there, as we do for the artists. But it is interesting. I think it's a funny situation, because lots of the freelancers we work with are doing so many exciting projects across the arts, and I know it benefits them in that respect. But it definitely is interesting seeing how those models of working kind of come and go.
Yeah. So how do you do it when you have projects? Then do people come to you saying, oh, I have a project, or you in the organization want to do a project and then try to recruit artists?
It's a bit of both. It depends what it is. So for our core program, in the space of a year, we have a few main elements. One of them is the SHAPE Open, which is big group exhibition of disabled and non-disabled artists in the summer. One of them is the Adam Reynolds Award, which sees us award a £10,000 grant to a kind of like mid-career disabled artist, and then support them in some kind of creative project as well, in addition to the bursary. And then as part of the Adam Reynolds Award, we also curate a kind of smaller group exhibition, which is what we're currently working on. So those are the kind of three pillars. There is also other stuff. So we work with schools, we commission things, but the way that basically, if you imagine it like the top tier, not in kind of order of priority, but in terms of what is most cemented into the program, are kind of like the Adam Reynolds Award, the SHAPE Open. But then everything else underneath it is very kind of like, we're in a fortunate position where we can be very flexible about it. So we have part of our budget is dedicated each year to commissioning things, but there's no kind of expectation of what that looks like. And throughout the year, we basically have conversations where we're like, oh, I think that we should commission something about this, or we should commission something about this, we should commission them. So that pot is very kind of adaptable, and it allows us to spend the year being like, what should we do? And in terms of how we work with people, it's really kind of varied. For the core program, so for the Adam Reynolds Award and the SHAPE Open, historically, they were both run as kind of open calls. So it would basically be somebody's full-time job to facilitate an open call over the space of a year, where artists can apply to win the Adam Reynolds Award, they can apply to be in the group exhibitions, and then people filter through the applications, a shortlist is decided, that kind of situation. But we basically changed that completely at the beginning of the pandemic, partly because of the pandemic and because we were doing it online and capacity was restricted, but also just partly because I think it was outdated. And we're very much, I think that idea of competition, we really didn't want to sustain that. So we didn't want people to be applying to stuff, which obviously takes a lot of time and energy. And even if you do pay people for applications, it's still, if they're unsuccessful, it's still kind of an unsustainable mode of working. So we kind of changed tactic on that, and for the past 2 years have basically been, at least for the core program, been doing our own continual research, basically constantly, and then throughout the year kind of sketching out through Google Docs in our minds who might be good for what bits and kind of putting them on lists. And then when it comes round to actually like, we need to do this exhibition now, like, well, I think that person might work, so why don't we have conversations with them? I think it's interesting because I think that wouldn't necessarily be possible were we not working with disabled creatives. And obviously there are holes in it, and it's not perfect, because I'm sure there are lots of disabled artists that we don't know. But there's quite, at least in the UK, there's quite a active and vocal community of disabled creatives online, especially through the course of the last 2 years, because so many disabled people have been shielding, and kind of had to make use of that in order to kind of stay connected to other disabled creatives. So we've been quite fortunate in that there's so much for us to see without ever going anywhere, that we can kind of, obviously there's a lot of people who've worked with Shape before, and we don't like to work with somebody once and then never talk to them again. Once we work with somebody, that relationship is there forever, essentially. They can always come back to us and say, I need this, which is kind of how the other part of our program operates. But yeah, basically at the minute we reach out to people that we think would be good, and try and build a relationship with them. And if the part of the program that we thought they would be great for isn't what they want to do, then we'll see how else we could support them, and maybe they'd fit into a different part. Maybe we could commission something instead. So it's essentially just very flexible. But yeah, so when we do work with people, we say to them, like, obviously we'll support you on this project, you can ask us for anything while this project is happening, but also after the project ends, like, you can come back to us for anything. You can come back to us for marketing support, you can come back to us for access consultancy, whatever. Come back to us if you need us. So the way that impacts things is that quite often we'll end up doing like mentorship. So we mentor some artists maybe over the course of like 6 months. We'll have a meeting every other week, to support them in producing a new project, whether that's just on access. Normally it's a bit of everything. Normally it's like they'll come to us because they'll have written in their application to Arts Council, I'm going to have consultancy from Shape Arts for the access. So we'll provide this mentorship initially for access support, but then it kind of always comes around to much more as well. Like, we'll always have a bit of creative input. We'll guide them in terms of resources and people they should talk to, and then like always providing marketing support and things like that as well. So it's kind of like, basically it's like trying to keep on top of everybody we could possibly know and then trying to be friends with them all and like pulling it in and like connecting the dots. And but it's obviously there are holes in it, because you know, there are a lot of disabled artists who probably aren't in the same network online, and it's really, I guess, the real challenge for us, and particularly through the last 2 years and kind of moving out of the pandemic, is how to reach those communities that we aren't in. So that's kind of where it's at. But it is interesting seeing how the kind of disabled creative network online has really kind of boomed in the past couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. So when people try to find you, they find you like online, or do you have like a certain like shop, like post where they can go and be like, I need help with a project?
It's mostly online. In the past, there's been various things. We do have an office, but it's not, at the minute, it's not set up for people to kind of just drop in, mostly because the staff aren't all in the office at most times. Like, we're mostly working from home still. But I think the end goal for our current office is that it will be more of a kind of creative hub. So things like having hot desks where artists can come in to use like Adobe software, so they don't have to buy it for themselves, stuff like that. I think that's the kind of direction that our physical space is heading in, but it's just not there yet because nobody's been able to do that in the pandemic. But that will be the kind of the office eventually. But yeah, at the minute it's mostly just kind of like emailing or phoning or messaging on Instagram or on Twitter, and basically sometimes people tag us in stuff. They'll be like, someone will tweet being like, what do I do about this? And someone will be like, oh, Shape Arts might know. And then suddenly we've got like a whole new relationship and somebody else to talk to. So it's just lots of little sparks that happen, and then you fall down a kind of rabbit hole of talking to this person who knows this person who knows this person who knows this person.
Yeah.
And you go round and round.
Yeah. So talking about like the online facilities and stuff, like especially with the pandemic, like how did that challenge you, and how did you go through that, and coming out of post-pandemic, how did that go?
It's interesting because obviously, and I'm sure a lot of disabled people would probably say the same thing, like when everybody was kind of forced to work from home, everything was delivered virtually. Obviously, a lot of disabled people were saying, we've been asking for this for so long. Why is it now? And only now that you've seen the light. Like, so many disabled people ask for flexible working, to be able to work from home, to be able to see theatre from home, all of these different things that weren't ever done or weren't ever granted to disabled people. Suddenly, you know, everybody was affected by the pandemic, so suddenly they were allowed to have it. So to some degree, there was like an unprecedented level of access for, I mean, not just for disabled people, for everybody, like being able to work from home, being able to experience culture from home, all of these things suddenly were possible. And I think that meant that we had somewhat of an opportunity to kind of get in on that conversation and create much more digital first projects. So the Shape Open, for example, being online for the past 2 years, but also we did our last Adam Reynolds group exhibition was an augmented reality app, which is something we would never have done before the pandemic. But like it made sense for people to be able to use their phone and kind of like see this space and whatever. So it's definitely influenced the kind of creative direction of our work. But it's also interesting because I think, obviously now moving back out of the pandemic, if we are, who knows, seeing how or how not that level of access is maintained. Places like theatres who have gone back to kind of filling every seat as opposed to social distancing. And obviously there are a lot of disabled audiences questioning why, if there are still so many vulnerable people, why they wouldn't just keep going on with socially distant seating. So there's a lot of those kind of conversations happening, but also generally, like, I think it's an important thing to mention that access is like not, people come to us so often being like, oh, you know everything about access, how do I make this thing accessible? And obviously one of the first things that we have to say to people is like, we don't know everything about access. That is like, you can't, there is no possible way to know everything about access. Like if you see the word fully accessible, it's a red flag, because there's just no way anything can be fully accessible, because so often individual disabled people's access needs are not only like completely different, even if they have the same like physical impairment. So like two wheelchair users you might assume that they have similar access needs, but they might have completely different wheelchairs that require completely different things. So there's so much diversity, and disabled people aren't monolithic in that respect, but also so often access needs are like in direct conflict with each other. Like one person's access needs might be to have really quiet space, somewhere to lie down, and another person's access needs might directly like challenge that. And sorry, I'm just gonna
That's fine, don't worry.
But yeah, it's interesting when you see people say, so I'm just gonna tell them I'm in a meeting.
Yeah, it's fine, don't worry.
I don't even know who that was. But yeah, there's often conflict between access needs. So this kind of conversation around how access has been improved by the pandemic and working conditions, and how it's now at risk moving back, needs that little bit of nuance, I think, which is that we need to be careful about assuming that access is the same for everybody, and that all disabled people benefit from working from home, and that all disabled people benefit from what, you know, that saying all disabled people benefit is the only thing that all disabled people benefit from, is people caring about access, people paying attention to access, people paying attention to the needs of disabled people. But like that's like up here on a practical level, there's very few individual things that you could do that would benefit all disabled people, in the same way that they wouldn't benefit everybody anyway, you know, like everybody's needs are completely different, disabled or not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's still something that people are still like you said, like they have to really be educated and really like see what they have to do and really care, isn't it? So that's another question I have. So like in your time working with shape arts and stuff, like have you, because I feel like there's like a stereotype of like how people in society think a disabled person looks like, and there's a stigma towards it, especially now that it's disabled artists. Like now that you've been working with shape arts, like how have you kind of learned about disabilities, and how have you like how have you like educated yourself in a way, like that makes sense?
I guess obviously, so I'm disabled anyway, and so I think for me the thing is that as soon as you learn about the social model of disability, which I learned about, I used to work at Wellcome Collection, which is a kind of gallery slash institution in London who are very hot on access in their physical spaces. So I learned about the social model when I was working there. So when I kind of started working with shape, it kind of just snowballed a bit, and like, I don't know, it all clicked for me in a way that I think I'd been looking for something to click. And I think it all just fell into place. I think it's one of those things that for me, it was less about finding out, like being like, oh my God, disabled people are people and people treat them like shit. It was more like I've been looking for a language to express these feelings, which I didn't have before. And now I have the words for it, and I can learn from this community that I now belong to. So it felt much more kind of like I had the feeling and I put words to it, rather than it all came at once. And I feel like the lessons that I've learned are probably more about non-disabled people than about disabled people. And kind of it's interesting when you kind of, obviously, because day to day we're having conversations with people where we talk about access. Like, I think it's interesting when you get to the point of picking up the small things that people say that make you question where they're coming from on disability. But the thing is like, I think probably the biggest lesson I've learned, or at least the thing that I believe the most, is that especially with the social model of disability, like if everybody in the country, everybody in the world kind of subscribe to the social model of disability and put access at the forefront of decision making, not only would it actually genuinely benefit everybody, because everybody's needs would be listened to, but like so many more people would identify as disabled. Like there's such a gray area, which I think is being explored quite interestingly by a lot of artists around this kind of chronic illness, disabled, neurodivergent, these kind of, because it's a difficult one, because identifying as disabled is historically a bit contentious, and people who are neurodivergent, particularly some autistic people, might not identify as disabled, even though like under the social model of disability, obviously we would not categorize them as disabled, but we would work with them under our basis, because hypothetically they're in the same category and they're still facing barriers. But it's funny, it's interesting seeing whether or not people identify as disabled. And there's a big thing about chronic illness as well, and a lot of people who are chronically ill might not identify as disabled, because there's a tension about whether the social model of disability is whether it kind of offers the same kind of liberation to people who are chronically ill, because the idea that society is the only thing disabling them might not stand up to reason when they really are like sick. And I think there's a real interesting subsection of the kind of creative landscape that we're a part of, where people are kind of trying to work out what this means. And especially in the light of long COVID, like the social model makes sense when you think about like a wheelchair user in a very kind of like stereotypical disabled person vision. Like obviously if there were just ramps everywhere, then nothing would disable a wheelchair user. Whereas if you've got long COVID, obviously there are things that could be done to meet your access needs and make life more livable and give you greater access and agency. But like it's like having a cold. Like if you're still sick, there's not a lot, you know, those are the problems that are viewed by some people as much more personal and less about social structures. So there's real grey areas, and it's definitely not as clean cut as all disabled people subscribe to this model and all disabled people would be benefited by this, or that all disabled people that we work with identify as disabled in the same way. It's very, very varied. I can't even remember where I started the sentence, but
it makes a lot of sense. So in Shape Arts, obviously you kind of work with non-disabled people, right? So
we work with non-disabled people for the Shape Open. Yeah.
So do they come with an already like an idea of what they're going into, like working with Shape Arts, and then they start working there and they're like, oh shit, that's not what I expected? Like,
I think so. For the past couple of years, where I'm kind of like in charge of the Shape Open, and the theory behind the Shape Open having disabled and non-disabled artists kind of goes back to when it was more of a physical exhibition and it was run as an open call. Because the idea was that you would get people in the room into this exhibition space. They wouldn't know what art was by who. They wouldn't know whether the artist was disabled or not. And it's very much kind of within that brackets of disability art and trying to wrong foot the audience and challenge expectations. So you're basically being like, it's lucky dip, you don't know if they're disabled, but if you're assuming they're disabled, then you need to like look in the mirror, basically. Like it's about challenging those assumptions. It's a bit different now because it's online and because we're not running it in that kind of same competition way. And I think that what we're doing a lot more kind of campaign culture sorts of projects now. So though we have disabled and non-disabled artists, we still try and make sure that all of the artists in the exhibition are barrier facing, so they're marginalized in some capacity, I guess. Basically, we try and work on that project with artists who have an understanding of the fact that there are barriers in place and that people face barriers and they probably face barriers themselves. And I guess to that end, the Shape Open is kind of evolving into something which is more of a discursive and like organic conversation around what it means to identify as disabled, what it means to be marginalized in the arts. And I think that that's where that kind of barriers thing that the social model gives us really comes in quite useful, because it unites everybody in a kind of, it provides agency to people regardless of disability or regardless of if they identify as disabled. And I think that that's the real kind of place at which the potential for radical change exists, because it's like almost like really it's kind of like a level up of intersectionality where like it's disabled and non-disabled artists, but they're all facing barriers, and the barriers kind of come from the same place. That the barriers are all there because of the whatever patriarchy, capitalism, whatever the bad force of evil is. Those barriers all really stem back and start from the same place. You know, the barriers that disabled people face are probably coming from a very similar place to the barriers that people of color face, that gender non-conforming people face. You know, those barriers start from the same cesspit, essentially. And so I think that the Shape Open is quite interesting in that respect, because it allows us that kind of like malleability when talking about disability. I think especially in the UK, like a lot of people are scared of disability, are scared of talking about disability, and have so many expectations about what disabled people look like. And so it's quite exciting, I think, to have that part of our program where we can kind of plug into the way that conversations around disability are changing. Because being a disability arts organization, historically a lot of the program has been very kind of cemented, and it's always a little bit kind of not outdated or traditional, but like the conversation gets stuck at a certain point because you're still just talking about disability in the same way. And I think that the Shape Open and bringing in different marginalized voices really does allow us to keep up with everybody else, essentially, and not get kind of stuck in our back alley of being a charity or whatever. It's contemporary and it's fast paced, which I think is good.
Yeah, like I guess like it's something that keeps progressing, like any other topic that keeps being talked about, like all about racism or like gender and stuff. Like it's still something that people have to learn about, but the conversation keeps changing, and it's at the point where it's not as negative, I guess.
Yeah.
Like in some points it's still negative because people don't want to educate themselves, but on some points do you see that there are more people trying to talk about it and be educated about it, so that's good, I guess. In all the like exhibitions that you've like worked and organized and all this, like what's like the highlight, like a piece of art that's been highlighted to you, like a memory and achievement like within your time in Shape Arts?
Gosh. I guess the most fun that I've had in terms of a project was probably the most recent Shape Open that we did, because it felt very cohesive as a unit, and I felt like all of the artists were really exciting and really talented, and like it just felt like it's super electric. But to be honest with you, like the best parts, the things that I find the most like meaningful are always like, so you'll be working with an artist, you'll be mentoring an artist, you might have commissioned them to make a painting, commissioned them to make a film, whatever, and you've been doing that over the course of a few months, and you've been sending out press releases for them, you've been trying to get people to pick them up, whatever, and like a month or so down the line you'll get an email out the blue being like, oh, I just wanted to let you know that I've been commissioned by so and so to do this. And that's the best bit. That's the best bit, when you see it working, when you know that like it's all fun and games for me to be like, oh, I'm curating an exhibition and there's really cool art, and obviously for me personally that's really fun, but in terms of like what I'm actually working on, it's to try and profile these artists and support these artists and get these artists to the place where they want to be. And so when that works, that makes me even happier, I think.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, those just like random emails that you get where you're like, oh, thanks so much, or by the way, like I'm now going up to Edinburgh to do this or something. That's perfect. Because then you see it working, and like you start to see the landscape changing as well. Yeah. Like when you see them moving out of the silo of just working with disability arts organizations, and they're being picked up by the mainstream, whether that's press, whether that's institutions, whether that's galleries or individual people, like when you see that start to work, not only am I obviously very happy for the artist, but I'm like, it ignites a bit of hope in me that we're doing good work in terms of actually changing the landscape, because it seems to be happening more and more. And I think people are paying more attention to disabled audiences, like programmers and curators. I think that they're paying more attention. So it's fun to see it start to very slowly build.
Yeah. What collaborations or like future plans that are happening in the organization are you most excited about?
So we actually just yesterday launched a collaboration with an organization called Everpress as part of the Shape Open from summer, which is kind of still ongoing until the end of the month. So a few of 7 artists from the exhibition worked with Everpress to design t-shirts, kind of off the back of their work from the show, and now they're on sale and they get portions of the profits. So that's super exciting, because again, that's like getting into the mainstream without it being like a sideshow, without them being like, these are our disabled friends, go and give them some money. Like it feels very kind of organic, like there is a respect and there's a authenticity to that relationship, which I think is exciting. Also, the artists get to have fun creating t-shirts and like getting profits from it, which I think is always just fun. It's fun to find ways to ethically and authentically, you know, be able to put money in people's pockets at the end of the day. In terms of future stuff, there's some really exciting stuff happening. Like I said earlier, so the Adam Reynolds Award, 2021's Adam Reynolds awardee, so the person who received the 10K bursary and for whom we kind of provided support on a creative project, was an artist called Johanna Hedver, who created this thing called Glut, which is like basically it has a physical and a digital form. The physical form is currently at the Hake Bay in Berlin, and the digital form is more of like a video game, but they're both essentially sound works that kind of engage with AI. There's a lot of like provocation about how new AI actually is, and it deals with things like spirituality, capitalism, Amazon, things like that. And so for the group exhibition under this year's Adam Reynolds program, we're inviting a group of artists to respond to GLUT, and kind of, they all have varied practices. We haven't gotten to the point of confirming those artists yet, so there's not much I can tell you, but the artists that we are in conversation with all have like very, very varied practice. There's like performance artists, there's artists who work drawing on paper, there's artists who create CGI landscapes. You know, it's very, very varied, but they all have these overlapping fragments of themes or of ideas. So I think it should be quite exciting, because they're going to take GLUT as their central provocation and then kind of like explode outwards and spiral off in loads of directions. So I think that that should be really exciting, and it's going to be online as well, that one, because it will be live probably like January, February time, and we're not really looking to physically program anything, probably not until like the second half of next year, if then. So that, I think that should be super exciting. I mean, I feel like we're on an upward trajectory, which is fun, which I'm kind of measuring both, what's the right word, through like quantitative data. Like obviously I like look at our analytics, and I monitor engagement and things like that, and you know, that's always rising anyway, but also like press and things like that. Like we're getting into the places that we want our artists to get into, and we're starting to kind of like guerrilla ourselves inside and hopefully be able to change kind of the higher upper places that we're having conversations with really interesting, well-known institutions about potential collaborations. And that's really exciting as well, like thinking what might happen in the next few years as we slowly kind of, I guess in my mind, I'm imagining it like someone dropped us as a seed in the kind of very traditional arts landscape, and we're like very slowly starting to kind of grow, and our tendrils are coming out, and we're getting into all of the nooks and crannies. And I feel like at some point in the next few years, that big kind of like flower head is gonna bloom, and I'm excited.
Yeah. Talking about like future plans and stuff, like from where you stand now, where do you want the organization to be challenged? Like, so it doesn't have like a linear progress. It's like, you know, how do you want to be challenged? Yeah.
I think that there is definitely soon going to be a challenge around this tension between digital and physical programming, and how you create a hybrid program, and like basically how you don't pretend the pandemic didn't happen, but you also don't restrict disabled artists and audiences only to online spaces. I think that's going to be a real challenge, not just for us, but other people that we, you know, other organizations, other partners that we work with who work with disabled people. Because right now I would say that a lot of people are still very much in favor of most things being hybrid, if not completely online. But I also know that if it continues where the only part of the arts sector that's doing digital programming is the disabled arts sector, then we're just going to re-silo ourselves, and we'll re-segregate ourselves off. So I think it's about working out the best kind of tactics to achieve both of those things, which are kind of in conflict with each other. That's going to be a big challenge. But I also think in terms of what the direction we're already heading in, and I think probably were heading in before the pandemic anyway, this idea of creative agency, both us as a creative agency, but also the creative agency of artists, and how you kind of straddle the two parts, which is one, we're a radical anti-capitalist organization. On the other hand, we appreciate that artists need to make money. We want to give them the tools and the skills and the resources to do that. And I think that trying to balance those two things is always a challenge anyway. But it'll be exciting to see how it comes together. I think that that's probably a challenge that will materialize very much within our office space, as I was talking about earlier. Like, I think that if we can create, I mean, again, it's like the physical digital tension too, because if we have an office space, we're probably going to have to create some kind of digital space as well. But providing the resources and the money for artists to then make their own money and have their own independence and agency is like the direction that we're going in, as opposed to just, I don't know. I think the problem with disability arts is that there is this tendency both to be siloed by traditional arts anyway, but also to kind of silo ourselves if we're not careful, because like, unless you are clever about it, unless you're a bit cheeky, for want of a better word, you've really got to kind of play the game to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your artists and audience without keeping them off over there. Just, you know, you've really got to mesh together the mainstream and the marginalized in order to make the change, I guess, or not mesh together, but make as loud as each other so that there is capacity for change. Because, you know, we could have a great thing going on over here in like a little bubble, but is it going to be that impactful on the broader scale unless we at least make other people listen? If not, you know, worm our way in and change things that way. But yeah, I don't know. I think those are probably the two main challenges.
Mm-hmm. And what's the, like, if you were in a spot right now where you could talk to like anyone and everyone, disabled or not, in the whole planet, what type of message from yourself or from the organization would you give?
I guess the main thing that makes sense to me when it comes to the kind of potential for liberation that things like the social model offer is that people just need to like have a bit more respect for themselves. Like, if you don't have to be disabled to say that you work better from your bed. You're allowed to work from your bed if you want to work from your bed, and you work better from your bed, you know? Mm-hmm. Like these kind of like small things. I think that there's a very ascetic pretense around work, particularly obviously because so much of it comes from capitalism and the economic structure anyway. But around work, people love to beat themselves with a stick over their back, you know? You don't have to be going to the office 5 days a week. It doesn't mean anything about the way that you work. And I think that that's the kind of key thing for me under the social model is like, disabled or not, you would be better off if people paid more respect to your needs. Like, other people would be better off if you paid more respect to their needs. And those needs aren't trivial. They're just what you want. And I think that that's okay. You know, like the idea of work needs a lot of change. So I guess, yeah, I would try and, the thing is obviously I could shout the social model of disability, but people run away when we talk about disability. So I think that it is about having compassion for others, but I think so much of it is about having compassion for yourself. Like, people are willing to put up with a lot of bad stuff, whether that's because they won't join a union or they just don't know about what their rights are. I don't know, but people will put up with a lot of bad stuff, and obviously so many of those people are like putting up with it because they have to, because they need the money. But I think that, yeah, I don't know, unionize and learn your rights and have some more respect for yourself.
Yes, definitely. Right, we're coming to the last question, right? Yeah. And I want you to imagine that a little girl or a little boy is coming to you, and she or he is disabled, and they have a dream of being an artist in any type of art they want to be, but they're sad because they don't know what to do, because no one will let them be artistic. What's your advice or lesson for these children?
I guess one thing is to never let anybody else tell you what it means to be creative, because creativity obviously doesn't have a form. It doesn't exist in that way. Like, anything could be, if you feel like it's creative. That is about as definitive the definition of creativity is, you know. So I think that they've really got to have a bit of tenacity to ignore people that want to challenge that. But I think that in terms of being a young person moving into very traditional landscapes like the arts, like arts education and things like that. A lot of it is probably about having good people around you, which isn't particularly useful advice, but if you can advocate for yourself, but you can also rely on a network of friends or family or peers who will also advocate for you and themselves. I think it's about collectivity, because you can know your rights as a disabled person. You can know that if you're a student and you're studying fine art and the building isn't accessible, that's illegal. Are they going to do anything about it? Probably not, because it's not like respected enough as a complaint for anybody to take it seriously, even though it is illegal for that to be the case. So I think it's about collectivity and building communities, because that's where the strength lies. And it doesn't mean that you have to only be friends with disabled people. It's just about making sure that the people that you are friends with, the people that you work with, the people that surround yourself with, that everybody there respects the power of the group or the collective, because I think that's where the power is. And I think if you're a young disabled person, then there's just so much stacked against you, both in barriers, but also mainly in attitudes. And I think it's a bit of a shitty situation at the minute, because really the only thing you can say is like, remember who you are and don't take shit from anybody, but you're still going to feel it, you know, even if you know that people are wrong, you'll still feel it. So I really think it's about building the structures around you to make sure that you're safe when that happens and that you're protected, but also that you have an arsenal, obviously not an actual arsenal, unless you want a violent revolution anytime soon, but like you have the arsenal of collectivity around you, because that's really the only antidote to a religiously individualistic society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely. Be true to yourself and never give up. Speech. Definitely.